Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the first Harkin Institute lecture. The Harkin Institute for Public Policy is a relatively new institute here at Iowa State University. In fact, it was just officially launched with a special ceremony about 30 minutes ago, although it was approved by the Board of Regents last spring. It was launched 30 minutes ago, and now we have its first official event, and it promises to be a very exciting and interesting one. We're honored to have the Harkin Institute for Public Policy here at Iowa State University. The person for whom it's named, long-serving U.S. Representative and U.S. Senator from Iowa, Tom Harkin, is a graduate of Iowa State, class of 1962 in government and economics. And we're delighted to have Senator Harkin's wife, Ruth, who's a member of the Board of Iowa Regents, with us today. Ruth, please stand and be recognized. The Harkin Institute is a tribute to Senator Harkin's many years of outstanding service and leadership, but more importantly, it's a valuable educational resource for Iowa State students and faculty and for the public at large who care about the study of public policy, and all of us should care about the study of public policy. As the Harkin Institute grows and develops, it will sponsor and support many important educational programs and activities for our faculty, for our students, for our state, and for the public at large. And this lecture today is the first official event. The Harkin Lecture is designed to become another jewel in the educational environment that we've worked hard to create here at Iowa State, and that so enriches our students' educational experiences in so many different ways. Like other campus events, such as the Manat Phelps Lecture, the Borlaug Lecture, and other lecture series, it's an event that is as much for the broader university community as it is for the university's faculty, staff, and students. Again, I want to thank all of you for joining us today for the inaugural Harkin Institute for Public Policy Lecture. And I'd like to thank Dr. David Peterson, Interim Director of the Harkin Institute, for organizing the details for today's lecture, and ask that he come forward to formally introduce today's speaker. David.
Thank you. Our speaker today is Charlie Cook. If you're like me, you knew a little while ago who Charlie Cook was. He is the preeminent political analyst in the country. If you want to know anything about elections, the Cook Political Report is mandatory reading. He's a frequent commentator for the National Journal and on NBC. One of the nice things about being the interim director is that you get to do things like this. And in part, I've got to interact a little bit with Charlie leading up to today. And the one thing I didn't know until now is exactly how generous and gracious he is. We asked him to give this lecture, and he graciously said yes. And then we asked him to teach a class, and he said, sure. And then we said, well, if you're doing one, how about two? And he said, okay. And he said, well, there might be people, and maybe we could do a little breakfast opportunity. He said, oh, sure, certainly for that. And then Iowa Public Radio called and said, could we interview him ahead of time? And I said, well, he's not really going to be in town very much, but I'll ask him. And he says, oh, yeah, we'll set it up early. I'll tape it before I come. As far as I understand, about 20 minutes before he got on the plane yesterday, we had another media request. And I said, well, I'm not so sure. And his answer was, well, if you can make it fit, go right ahead. Unfortunately, we couldn't make it fit. But what we can make fit is the lecture today. And so I'd like to ask Charlie to come up and share his thoughts with us. Thank you.
I don't know about top political analysts in the country, but how about top political analysts standing on this stage right now? I'll accept that. No, it's a great honor to be asked to come to Ames and to present this inaugural lecture at Iowa State's new Harkin Institute of Public Policy. And I'd like to thank President Jeffrey and Provost Betsy Hoffman and Dave Peterson, the interim director, for and everyone the honor of coming, and not only coming to the home of the first digital computer and a 2011 Nobel Prize winner, but more importantly, where Rice Krispie Puffs or Rice Krispie Squares. Yes, was invented. I mean, what more What greater contribution to society could any university do than that? And earlier this year, I went to the funeral service for Chuck Manette, another Iowa State graduate, and you know, it's great to have a Democratic national chairman whose funeral is sort of emceed by a former Republican national chairman, and that says something about Chuck Manette. The papers, the exhibits, and the lessons to be gleaned from Tom Harkin's 10 years in the House and service in the U.S. Senate, I think, will be an enormous benefit for future students here at Iowa State and the people of and generations of people from Iowa. And no doubt there are going to be future members of the U.S. House of Representatives and senators who are current or future students here at Iowa State that will benefit from the knowledge. 36 years ago, Ronald Reagan gave a speech in which he implored Republicans to raise a banner of bold colors, not pale pastels. Now, Ronald Reagan and Tom Harkin didn't agree on a lot of issues, but I think you could say that there was one thing in common. They were both chose bold colors and not pale pastels, and Tom Harkin is not no pale pastel. And you could agree or disagree with Tom Harkin on any issue or many issues, or I think there are a few people that probably disagree with him on everything. But they can't deny his passion, his tenacity, and his commitment to public service. And I think the fruits of his career in Washington lead a lot, will leave a lot, some real lessons and things, resources for students to enjoy. In 1972, 39 years ago, I moved to Washington to start college, and within 6 months, I found myself as an elevator operator. They had these old-timey elevators in the old House and Senate office buildings that had these sort of crank things, and what you really were was sort of a tour guide or giving advice to tourists on how to find Senator so-and-so's office or whatever. But it gave me an opportunity to see as a 19-year-old young person to meet some of the great titans in American politics of that time, and to meet Barry Goldwater and Hubert Humphrey and George McGovern. And it gave me appreciation for what leadership is and what it looks like up close and personal at an early age. And in those 39 years that I've lived in Washington, I've never come across a more tireless crusader for what he believes in than Tom Harkin. And it may not be the same bold color that Ronald Reagan was looking for, but it was definitely a bold color. And Harkin was never a guy that would lick his finger and stick it up in the air and see which way the wind was blowing. As Frank Sinatra would say, he did it his way. A couple of weeks ago, I was visiting Fayetteville, Arkansas, on the main campus of the University of Arkansas, where my dad and both my sisters and both their husbands went. And there's a wonderful tradition. I think it's the only school in the country that does this. Every graduate in the history of the University of Arkansas has their name etched in a sidewalk somewhere on that campus. Needless to say, there are sidewalks that go to nowhere. And I mean, there's sidewalks around the dairy farms. I mean, they're everywhere. But it's a great tradition, and to go, particularly on a football weekend, and see your father's name and your sisters and their husbands and all of that. It's a great tradition. And over the history, you wonder where am I going with this? Since 1789, about 15,000 people have served in Congress. 15,000. And very, very few of them will ever be remembered for anything. And yet, last year we celebrated the 21st or the 20th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which Senator Harkin was the primary Senate sponsor. And the thing is, there are people that will be born when we're all dead that will benefit, disabled people that will benefit from the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I would bet you there are fewer than 5 people in Congress today that will have a legacy event like that to point to, and where they change lives of people not yet born. That's really is quite something. And and to work with President George H.W. Bush and Steve Bartlett, a Republican in the House that was the former mayor of Dallas. I mean, how much different can somebody be than from Tom Harkin than that? And work across party lines to get that done. And Tom Harkin's done so much over the years, but that's the one thing that long after we're gone will still be around. And then finally, it's hard to talk about, and then we'll get into talking about politics, but it's kind of hard to talk about Tom Harkin without talking about Ruth for a second. And what a lot of people don't realize is that Ruth was the first Harkin to win elected office here in Iowa. That Ruth was elected the prosecutor for Story County back in 1972 as Tom was running for the House and losing. He didn't get elected till 2 years later. And so the thing about it is, but for history being a little different, we might be dedicating a different Harkin Institute here, or a Harkin Institute named after a different Harkin. But anyway, she's just a force of nature in herself. Now let's talk about politics. And to me, John Edwards, when he was running for president, you remember he used to talk about we have two Americas. Well, I've come to the conclusion that, and maybe, he wasn't talking about 99% and 1% then. But politically speaking, the way I look at it, we actually have three Americas. And we have a red Republican conservative America, and we have a blue Democratic liberal America, and then we have a purple independent moderate America. And each of these three groups are so totally different from the other that if they're not talking different languages, they're certainly talking different dialects. And think about each one of them one at a time, and then we'll jump into 2012. Red Republican conservative America. They love to watch Fox News. They like to listen to Rush Limbaugh. They like to go online at Red State and Free Republic. That in 2000, in the Bush-Gore election, 91% of them voted for George Bush over Al Gore. In 2004, 93% of them voted for George Bush over John Kerry. In 2008, 90% of them voted for John McCain over Barack Obama. And in the congressional midterm elections in 2006, 2008, 91% voted Republican in 2006 and 95% in 2000. And 95% in 2010. No ambiguity there whatsoever. We know what they look like. We know how they feel. Then look over to on blue Democratic America, and it's almost it doesn't have much more ambiguity than that. To a lesser extent, they watch MSNBC at night, or they go online and read Huffington Post. In 2000, 86% of them voted for Al Gore over George W. Bush. 89% voted for John Kerry over George W. Bush. 89% voted for Obama over McCain. And 93% of them voted for Democrats for Congress in 2006, and 92% voted for Democrats for Congress in 2010. And so their numbers are only slightly less definitive as it is among Republicans. But then you get to purple middle America. And those are the people that are between those 40-yard lines in American politics. In 2000, 47% of independents voted for George W. Bush and 45% voted for Al Gore. In 2004, 49% voted for John Kerry and 48% voted for George W. Bush. In 2008, the margin widened a bit. 52% voted for Barack Obama and 44% voted for John McCain. The big differences was in the midterm elections. In 2006, those independent voters voted by an 18-point margin in favor of Democrats for Congress. And in 2010, they voted for Republicans for Congress by a 18-point margin. So if this were an Austin Powers movie, you get your mojo from these independent voters in the middle. And the thing about it is these independent voters, they're very different from Democrats and Republicans in another ways. Independent voters don't like politics. They're not particularly interested in politics, most of them. They don't particularly like politicians. And while conservatives and Republicans have passion watching Fox at night, and to a lesser extent, Democrats and liberals have passion watching MSNBC at night, you know what's the number one rated cable network in the country? For the last 4 years, it's the USA Network. It's where you'll see reruns of Law and Order SVU and NCIS and inexplicably Monk or House, and where WWE Wrestling. And if they're not watching that, maybe they're watching Dancing with the Stars or American Idol on some other network, but they're watching things that have absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with politics. They're not hanging on every word, waiting to hear what the latest out of John Boehner's mouth or Nancy Pelosi or Mitch McConnell or Harry Reid's mouth. They don't follow this stuff. And the thing about it so much, and the thing about these independent voters is sometimes they're not really clear about what they do want. But boy, they're very, very articulate when they're upset with one side or the other. And whether it's 2006, when a lot of them were upset with the war in Iraq, or some of them were upset with a bunch of Republican scandals in Capitol Hill, they're upset with President Bush and just kicked the daylights out of Republicans. Or 2010, when they were upset with President Obama and Speaker Pelosi, and maybe some of them didn't like the health care bill, it just kicked the daylights out of Democrats. They're very clear about expressing what they don't like. And those are the people to watch in politics. And, you know, I'm not addicted to this stuff. Every day about 12 o'clock, actually about 12:05 Central Time, the new Gallup poll comes out with the 3-night moving average of the president's numbers for 500 interviews a night. So it's 1,500. And again, I'm not addicted to this stuff at all. And on Mondays they release the 3,500 interviews for the previous 7 days through the night before. And when you look at those, you know, overall the president's approval rating is 43% for last week, 49% disapprove. And it's sort of, he's been averaging sort of between 40 and 45% since early July. In that kind of window, it was 46% in early July, and then after that it's been the 40-45 range. And that's a real pivotal point to watch, because there's sort of a range, a tipping point, if you will, of around a 48, 49, 50, that historically presidents with approval ratings going into Election Day, I should emphasize, of above that 48 to 50 range, they've won, and the ones below that point, they've lost. And whether it's Bill Clinton, who had a 54% Gallup approval rating going into Election Day, Reagan 58, Nixon 59, Eisenhower 68, I'm only talking about elected incumbents running for re-election, or whether it's the ones that were below that point, like George W. Bush in 1992 at 34%, or Jimmy Carter at 37%, and they lost. Interestingly, the one that was right on the line was George W. Bush at 48%. And that was a race, and some of you may remember on Election Day when the exit polls were coming out, they were actually showing Kerry ahead in a lot of the exit polls during the day. And in the end, President Bush was reelected 51-48, but very, very close. And he was the guy right on the line. And I'm not included non-elected presidents, but basically President Truman was sort of averaging right at that tipping point in 48 when he won. And so for President Obama to get reelected, just sort of general, rather than watching the trial heats, I would suggest you watch the approval rating, and every month that goes by, that approval rating becomes a better predictor than it was the month before. And so by the time you get into Election Day, it's a pretty darn good predictor of whether a president's going to come in above the line or below the line. But what I was getting at was once a week on Mondays when Gallup releases those numbers, they release the numbers by party as well. And to me, that's actually what tells the story. For example, among Democrats, President Obama's approval rating for the last week was 79%. Among Republicans, only 10% of Republicans approved the job he's doing. Now, where they are, I'm not sure, because I haven't met any of those folks lately. But anyway, but among those independents, the group that I really focus on, and I would suggest if you get your hands on the data that splits it out by party, ignore Democrats, ignore Republicans, and watch those independents. And among independents, his approval rating was 39%. Now, keep in mind that President Obama won 52-44. And so now he won with 365 electoral votes. It was a margin of about 7-8 points. So he had a cushion. But you don't get reelected if your approval rating with independents is only 39%. So watch that number very, very, very closely and see where it goes and how close up can it get to as a tip-off of whether he's going to get reelected or not. The other thing about independents is one of the questions that pollsters like to ask is generally do you ask the independents, I should say, is do you lean to the Democratic side or do you lean to the Republican side? And one of the things pollsters have found is that people who call themselves independents, but if they say they lean to the Democratic side, if you press them, you find out that they actually usually vote for Democrats. And the independents who say they lean to the Republican side, they actually vote for Republicans most of the time. That there's some people who have some deep inner-seated psychological need to call themselves independents, but functionally speaking, they're partisans, either Democrat or Republican. But the ones that say, no, I don't lean either way, those are the people that are between the 48-yard line voters. Those are the people to really watch. And last week, the approval rating there was 30%. So watch where it says pure independence. Watch that number as the year goes on, because that will give you a very, very good indicator of where this thing's going. Obviously, the people in the two parties, they have very different views. I mean, you listen in focus groups and you listen to open-ended questions, you read open-ended questions from Democrats, and, well, things haven't worked out as well as we wanted, but he's trying very hard. He's doing his best. Republicans are obstructing. But there is some disappointment there, but still pretty solid commitment behind the president. On the Republican side, he's wrong-headed. He wants to take the country to go in the wrong direction. He's all wrong. Nothing's right. I mean, you get that. But to me, it's that purple America that they're the people that it's a more nuanced view. On the one hand, when you hear them talking about the president, you will hear them say they like him, they think he's a smart person, and they think that his intentions are good, that he has a vision for the country. So in that sense, they sound like Democrats. But then they say, but he hasn't been effective. Maybe he's over his head. Maybe he wasn't experienced enough. Or maybe he's not tough enough. And then they're different from Republicans because, most Republicans don't even like him. But where there's it's performance related. You don't hear that many independents saying he's too liberal, or you don't hear the independents say he's a communist or a socialist, something like that. It's more, has he measured up? It's performance related. Has he measured up to the job? And what this leads to is when incumbent presidents are running for re-election, usually it's a referendum on the president. It's a question of, do we want to renew this president's contract for another 4 years, yes or no? If there's no incumbent president running, if it's just a choice, that's like walking into Baskin-Robbins and you see the sign with the 31 flavors and you narrow it down to 2 and then you're choosing between strawberry and pistachio. That's a choice. But usually with incumbent presidents, it's a referendum up or down, and the dominant factor is the economy. Now, I say usually because it's not always the case. And I think the case study that we're going to be watching, or that the president and the White House are going to be studying very closely, is the 2004 election when President George W. Bush's job approval rating was just 48% going into Election Day. And remember, this was the first presidential election after 9/11. And so concern about terrorism and threats to national security, keeping us safe, was a very strong consideration. But at the same time, the war in Iraq was very, very, very controversial. There was a very real risk of that being a referendum election, up or down, not on the economy, but on Iraq. And if it were an up or down referendum on Iraq, President Bush may very well have lost that election. But what they were able to sort of very skillfully do is maneuver it and keep the focus more on national security, terrorism, keeping us safe and away from Iraq, and keeping it more of a choice rather than a referendum. Now, where the economy is now, unemployment, as you all know, is 9% right now. The new numbers for November will be out on Friday morning. And when you look at the forecasts, the blue chip economic indicators, for example, that is a survey every month of 54 of the top economists in the country, and their consensus forecast, the last one, was for unemployment to be at 8.9% for the third quarter and for the fourth quarter of next year. Now, that's only 1/10 of a point better than we are right now. And generally speaking, incumbent presidents don't get reelected with unemployment at 8.9% if those consensus forecasts are accurate. And I think that when the president said 6 or 8 weeks ago that he's got an uphill fight for reelection, he wasn't exaggerating, because if it is a referendum election on the economy, odds are he's going to lose that. The question is, will it be a referendum or will it be a choice? And the thing is, for the Republican Party, 2/3, the old Rockefeller wing of the Republican Party, what they used to call the liberal wing of the Republican Party, that party's kind of gone. It really doesn't exist much anymore. And what was the sort of mainstream, and by mainstream what I mean is the party of Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford and George H.W. Bush and Bob Dole, and I might actually even stretch it out. And even though Ronald Reagan was not considered necessarily a middle-of-the-road Republican back then, for a guy that signed one of the most liberal abortion laws in the country, for somebody who did go along with some tax increases at key points in his presidency, I'm not sure how that guy with that record would do on the stage right now in some of these debates, where in retrospect, he actually now is in that wing. And you might even throw out, in 2000, what was the George W. Bush's theme? Compassionate conservatism. I'm not sure how that would go over in the debates. I haven't heard Herman Cain talk about compassionate conservatism or Newt or any of these folks. So that even that, but the thing is, 2/3 of the Republican Party is very, 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 very conservative, and they really want to nominate a very, very, very conservative candidate. And the challenge they have is that the candidates that come in from that wing of the party are having really difficult times measuring up to sort of what you need to be to win a Republican nomination. And whether it was, Michelle Bachmann surged first and then sort of pooped out, and then Rick Perry moved up, and I'll talk more about him in a minute, and then he kind of gave way, and then you had Herman Cain moved up and come back down, and as of an hour or two ago is reassessing his candidacy in the wake of some newer allegations, and now Newt Gingrich is up, and there's obviously, I met very few elected officials who are smarter or have more ideas than Newt Gingrich, and some of the ideas are good ones, and some of them maybe not, and Newt's a very big package. I mean, there's. And the thing is, he really is, and he's one of the most interesting people to talk to you will ever talk to in politics. But I oftentimes I visualize when I see Newt and all these ideas and this excitement and energy and generosity, but I see this little door right behind him, and the door leads into a closet. And as soon as the closet door, these suitcases, this baggage starts kind of falling out, and you've got to go, oh gosh, this isn't going to be pretty. And so you sort of watch that, and you think, this is it. And I know, there's a lot of duck hunting here in Iowa as there is in Louisiana. The turduckens, the chicken, where there's sort of a lot going on there. And that's the sort of thing with Newt. There's some good stuff in there, but boy, you don't know where everything really comes. But fascinating guy. But is he going to be able to hold up? And the thing is, when we think about who normally wins party nominations, it's normally somebody that sadly can raise a heck of a lot of money and has the money to withstand losing some early contests where they've got money that will last them, where their campaigns are not living week to week, month to month. It's a campaign that's got an infrastructure, organization that's out there, not just in Iowa, but nationwide. It's people where there's a campaign that has expertise, of people who know how to win elections. A few weeks ago, Herman Cain was taking a bus trip from Memphis in the western corner of Tennessee to Cookeville in the far eastern part of the state. And 2 whole days on a bus trip in a state that doesn't even vote till March. And you think, what in the world are they thinking about? Does anybody know? If Gertrude Stein were a political analyst and alive, she'd be saying there's no there. You have to have all these things coming together and be able to sort of withstand, the electron microscope scrutiny. And that's why my feeling is that these 2/3 of Republicans that desperately want a really, 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 really conservative candidate, that they're kind of getting let down one at a time. And my hunch is that you're going to see these real conservatives going through the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross stages of grief. With denial, and eventually comes up with bargaining and acceptance, and that they're going to probably end up with someone from more the mainstream wing of the party, more like a Romney, who, even though there's some that have some huge problems with him over the health care plan or over his, let's just say, dexterity on some social and cultural issues, not being terribly deeply encumbered by principles on some of these things, or whether it's his faith. But the thing about it is, I don't think they don't want to nominate someone like that, but my hunch is they will, and in the end, that's the one that's more likely to make it a referendum election than a more starker ideological contrast that is more of a choice election. And if it's a choice election, maybe Republicans win, maybe President Obama wins, but that's more likely to be a fair fight than if it's a referendum election. And so I think, we'll just sort of see how that moves along. And obviously you here in Iowa have the 50-yard line seat. And I've speaking to a couple of classes this morning, one of the points I was making is that that here in Iowa, there's nothing unique to Iowa or New Hampshire for that matter that says, it's not in the Ten Commandments or the Magna Carta or the Constitution that you have to go first, and that theoretically another state could fill that need. But I think the reason that Iowa and New Hampshire are both unique is that you get the attention, you get all the money from out of state coming in, but you also understand the responsibilities, the obligations that go with it. It means going to the community center in West Des Moines and listening to candidates. It means going and listening to these people, asking them questions, kicking the tires. And another state could do it, but it would probably take 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 presidential election campaigns before they would figure out what they were supposed to do in exchange for all the money and attention, the largesse that they're getting. And so to me, that's the unique role for Iowa and New Hampshire, and why I think it's going to continue. Now, I have to say that the debates that have come in this year, Steve Schmidt, who was one of the top people for the McCain campaign, compared the debates this year, the Republican debates, to like American Idol. And where people would be watching week to week and seeing who's up and impressive and who's humiliates themselves on national television, and sort of cheering for one or the other in sort of an engagement that I think has taken a lot of the attention, the early attention, away from Iowa and New Hampshire, and sort of I think it may have a process of sort of informally winnowing the field down or culling it down and creating tiers. And I think that's happened. And obviously, I think I think if there's a lesson to be learned from this, if I were Rick Perry, the lesson is he should have gotten in this race back in January, February of last year, come to Iowa and sort of had his shakedown cruise early on before the debate started, and in Cedar Rapids and Waterloo and Council Bluffs, and doing things where if he says something that maybe not have been particularly politically opportune, maybe it was just in front of a Rotary Club and not on national television. You know, there's a reason why Broadway plays usually don't preview in New York City. You know, they go to Hartford or Providence or Baltimore. They go other places to preview, to work the kinks out. And Rick Perry didn't do that. And the thing is, I'm focusing a little on Perry because he had the capability of raising money and being the dominant conservative alternative to Romney. And yet, I think by getting in too late in the process, he was more like Spider-Man previewing in New York, and the preview was just horrific, and we see sort of what's happened. So the thing is, I don't mean to come to Iowa and tell you what, I don't know what's going to happen. All we could do is sort of look at history, look at what normally happens, and kind of calculate the odds. But you here, you're the deciders, as President Bush would say. And, this race is going to look a lot different coming out of Iowa, and I would throw in New Hampshire as well than it did coming in. And it's an important responsibility, and I think Iowa and New Hampshire together, I think they provide a service of narrowing down the field. And we've got an exciting election to watch, and I'm gone on too long. And but I guess I just come up with when I look at what does it take to win a nomination, I think conservatives, Stephen Stills, there was a song, what is it? If you can't be with the one you love the one you're with. And, I think conservatives are going to have to learn to love somebody that they hadn't been loving before, because that's probably who they're going to end up with. But in the end, it would probably be their strongest horse, and we'll see. And the ultimate irony is going to be that I think President Obama and his team are going to be taking the Bush 2004 Karl Rove playbook and taking it apart chapter by chapter, page by page, line by line, and figuring out what can they adapt to help them get reelected, because obviously that Bush-Kerry election could very easily have gone a different way, and some of it may be applicable, some of it not. But anyway, thank you very much for having me here, and I just think this is going to be such a fabulous resource for Iowa State. And, when you go around the country and you look, for example, the University of Kansas has the Dole Institute for Bob Dole, and it's just provided a terrific resource for people in Kansas and students at the University of Kansas, and I'm sure that the Harkin Institute is going to do the same thing. So I'm honored to be here, and thank you very much. And thank you for all the hospitality, all those many times I've been to the State Fair, and yes, I did have the bacon on a stick, but thank you very much.
We have a little time for questions. We have a microphone set up in the back of the room, so I think if we could, I think it might be easiest for folks to line up behind the mic to ask questions, if that's okay.
Comments or accusations?
Yes. And I'll sit down and let you answer. Hold on, we've got this answer.
Yes, sir.
I didn't intend to be first. Let's have some more. I'm Jim Hutter, political science. Let's take a little look at the caucuses themselves. This microphone that you have has hosted just about every presidential candidate in years in this very room. We are indeed very blessed. But there are, of course, around the country and here in Iowa, some concerns. People can't vote absentee. They have to vote between 7 and 8 in the Republicans and 7 and 10 in the Democratic. And then it used to be back in the 70s when we sort of got the mojo that the East Coast reporters said, well, Iowans are too liberal. I've even seen, we're the most liberal state. Holy cow. And now the Republicans are really off to the right so far. I mean, Mike Huckabee, give me a break. What would you like to suggest? And as the media, don't you have, broadly more responsibility for looking at the caucuses in Iowa and the primaries in New Hampshire and saying, is there a way to be better?
Well, I'm certainly not going to stand here and declare war on the Iowa caucus. I mean, if a southern state that was a Voting Rights Act state tried to do it, I'd say good luck to them, because they might not get past the Justice Department. But the thing about it is we have to live in the world we live in. And if Iowa were to convert to a primary, the same as New Hampshire, it would probably, the next one would probably be held in the summer of 2015. I mean, that in a perfect world, you would do everything you can to maximize participation. Having said that, to be honest, this caucus, the turnout has gotten up to the point where it's not to a primary level, but it's a pretty darn big caucus. To me, the part of Iowa that may not be long-lived in the political process is I'm beginning to have grave doubts about the future of the straw poll, because it has gotten awfully exotic. And a lot of Republicans I know personally don't come up here for it. I mean, and they don't feel. I mean, years and years ago, a couple lived in Des Moines, friends of ours, and I rode up. It was back when I didn't have a travel budget or much of one, and so I stayed at their house. And we drove up and we went to the straw poll. This is years and years and years ago. And in the car on the way back, the car was very quiet. These were very Republican people, and the husband said, I don't recognize that party. And the thing is, that was before the party was as conservative as it is right now. And I wonder whether the straw poll is next time is going to get the same kind of attention and focus. And, you know, for me, the utility is coming up here, besides an excuse to go to the state fair, but is going around and watching the candidates in small venues interact, speaking to voters, watching the voters' response, watching the interaction, you know, here and I should add in New Hampshire. To me, that is really, I mean, my plan for 4 years ago is probably to leave before they count. Or 4 or 8 years from now, leave before they end up counting the votes, because I don't really care what the count is. To me, it's watching the interaction of the candidates. But in terms of the caucus itself, as a practical matter, I don't see how you could convert to a primary and maintain your role. I mean, I don't see how that happens. I don't think it does happen. And so I think the one thing that keeps its uniqueness is by calling it a caucus, and maybe there are things you could do to tweak the hours, you know, have it on Saturdays, make it longer. Maybe, you know, I don't know how the heck you could do a caucus and maintain a secret ballot, you know, or any, I mean, I don't know how you would do that. But there might be ways to tweak it. But to me, the day that Iowa is no longer a caucus is the day that it gets into a fight with New Hampshire and conceivably other places that has no end. And so it's not a perfect situation by a long shot. And there are probably things that can be done to make it more inclusive. But I think the two things that would probably kill its uniqueness, its prominence, would either be A, moving in December, where Santa Claus and politics don't mix so well, or switching to a primary and getting into a nonstop fight with New Hampshire.
I'd like your thoughts on whether you think this election cycle is an aberration or whether our country is headed for bad times because we don't seem to be producing effective leadership anymore. I mean, you outline why President Obama could be in real trouble next year. but yet you look at the Republican field, and I can't imagine any of these folks being president.
Well, I'm not going to touch the subjective part of that, but because the doors are all on that end of the room. But I do think that I do think that we have real problems with our system, and where if the normal constitutional means of addressing the big challenges facing the country aren't working, and if these workarounds like a base closing style commission to deal with budget debt issues or the super committee, if the traditional way the founding fathers had in mind isn't working, and if the workarounds aren't working, what is going to work? And that's a great question. And I had hoped, and to me, the sort of the partisanship, the venom, to me, it kind of started in the mid 80s, but it was confined mostly to the House of Representatives, and it made the House a somewhat unpleasant place to watch. But the thing is, in the House, it's majority rules. And no matter whether it's Democrats in the minority or Republicans in the majority, what the minority wants or cares about really doesn't matter much. But it's when you started seeing a lot of the post-poisonous House members started moving over into the Senate and bringing that over into the Senate, which is a body where with filibusters and unanimous consents, and where it's like a non-native species being introduced into a new place that can't deal with it. And the Senate cannot function with this kind of poison. That's where it went from a problem to a gigantic problem. And to me, the event that had the potential to really change things was 9/11. And something that was just such a horrific event, but you remember that members of Congress of both parties, House and Senate, came together on the steps of the Capitol building, and they sang "God Bless America." And it really was a time when party briefly didn't mean much. And then, and again, I'm not blaming either side, but the controversy, should we go to war with Iraq or not, it's almost like it took that momentary period of unity and broke it apart and opened the wound that hasn't come back together since then. And, the thing that worries me is if an event as horrific as 9/11 can't bring the country together, gosh, what in the world would it take? And how horrific an event might it be to sort of precipitate bringing this back together? And now, I think if God didn't look after this country, when you think of the revolution, you think of Civil War, you think of Reconstruction, the Depression, something happens. The pendulum always seems to move back. And I know it sounds kind of naive and Pollyannish, but something will happen. But can I tell you that event is going to change? I can't. And I don't have a solution for that. I don't know what it is. I'm determined we are going to get through this, and something will happen to kind of rejigger it. But for the life of me, I don't know what it will be. But I think it's something that we all need to really worry about, and why, young people, why it really is important for them to get involved and get engaged, and to try to recast politics and public service in a different way. I think that's enormously important, because it's not going in a good place right now, and I think that's one thing that both sides could probably agree on. Yeah.
A former Republican member of Congress recently told me that the big rumor in Washington, D.C., which he in fact believes, is that President Obama is going to put Hillary Clinton on the ticket as his vice president, and Biden will move to Secretary of State. So I was just wondering if you've heard that. Do you put much credence in it? Or, finally, do you think that Obama will do something similar to that, if not Clinton, someone else, to kind of shake things up?
I have heard people speculate in that way, but not anybody that had ever met President Obama. The thing is, let's sort of start at the top and work down. Number one, Joe Biden isn't the problem. I mean, it could have been. I mean, it doesn't take much imagination to have imagined him in his lovable, off-the-cuff way saying things that could have created huge problems. But that hasn't happened. And the thing is, you know, you could say that a lot of decisions in the first year and a half of the administration were fateful ones and that put them on a trajectory that leads them to a very tough place. But you can't really dump it off on Biden, number one. Number two, I think to dump Biden and for Biden to be not on the ticket for anything other than absolutely legitimate, honest-to-God health reasons, I think it would look crass, it would look political, it would look desperate, and it would probably do more harm than good. Okay, that. And then you get to Secretary Clinton. Personally, I think she's been a terrific Secretary of State. I think she's worked her tail off. I think when you watch her on television, she looks beat. She looks flat tuckered out. And the thing about it is, I wouldn't be surprised if she couldn't tell you to the day how many days are left between now and January 20th, 2013. And whether her plans are to be a president of a college or university or, you know, a great foundation or just be a grandmom or what. But I think this tour of duty, I think, is going to be her last. And quite frankly, under the circumstances we're in right now, I'm not sure she'd take it. I mean, if he looked like he was coasting towards an easy reelection, you know, sure, why not? But right now, God, that'd be if this ticket were, if it, I don't think it would do any good. And if it were to go down, is that how she'd want to end her career? And so I don't put any stock in it whatsoever. I really don't. I just don't, because I don't think it would achieve the purpose. And let me throw out one other little nugget. This White House, this president, I think they are doing everything in their power not to look desperate and not to show weakness. And, I mean, there's no other, I mean, why else are they having the convention in Charlotte, North Carolina, a right-to-work state? I mean, it's to project, put confidence. And we can, you know, that. And ditching your vice president, gosh, that looks like, I mean, I'm not sure that'd be the message I would want to send. Yes, sir.
My name's Brian Davis. Sorry, I have a little cough. I'm from Texas originally. Now, I am an independent, not left or right.
I'm from Louisiana, and I'm sorry.
Well, we're not that far. We're not that far from each other.
On behalf of all people from Louisiana and LSU fans, thank you for beating Oklahoma State.
We have problems with Iowa at times, but my question is, since you are hinting that Mitt Romney is going to get the Republican nomination,
that I think he will.
You sound like you're hinting. How is he going to influence Republicans to be okay with his fate? What do you think about that?
To me, and look, if I'm wrong and Newt Gingrich wins the Republican nomination, besides the fact that I will never be able to live it down, but the thing about it is, beside that, having been so wrong, to me, the question is, if I'm right and Romney wins the Republican nomination, does he win it quickly and cleanly, or is it long and messy? And I think that, and that goes in part to your point, that let's say, hypothetically, he does very, very well in Iowa, wins New Hampshire, the resources, the fundraising, everything for the rest of these candidates starts to dry up, moves on to the nomination. If it's quick and clean and there's good closure behind him, then he could pick a running mate that reinforces sort of competent, mainstream, mainstream competence, okay? Now, that's one scenario. And that one might lead to maybe he picks Mitch Daniels, the governor of Indiana, or maybe he picks Tim Pawlenty from Iowa. Maybe he picks Bob McDonnell, the governor of Virginia. Maybe he picks a Rob Portman, a senator from Ohio, and former budget and trade director. Something like that. But let's say it's long and messy, and there are real pockets of resistance, including those that have huge problems with his faith. That lends him towards having to go in a different direction and to do these awkward, weirdo ticket balancing things that are designed to sort of paper over problems. I mean, to me, the classic of the former, the classic example of a running mate was in 1992 when Bill Clinton picked someone who was from a neighboring state, basically the same age, same demographics, same ideological bent, basically picking Al Gore to reinforce sort of moderate Southern Democrat and a generational message, as opposed to going off in another direction where you're trying to paper over and gloss over problems within your party and address concerns. And if Romney is having huge pushback on his faith, then, maybe he does, and I noticed that there's a not Mike Huckabee fan here, but maybe he does a Mike Huckabee, and that might work because it's a governor, but he may have, what if he has to go farther down that way, where it's not a pick that would help him with those independents between the 40-yard lines, and particularly those ones between the 48-yard lines, and that doesn't help the performance-driven, competence-oriented purple America, then that takes him off to a very, very, very different place. Now, I think the one thing that does work in Romney's favor is that and the polling shows this, that a lot of the people with some of the bigger issues with electing a president of the Mormon faith or nominating some of the Mormon, they are in the Republican Party, and the one thing that they may dislike or mistrust more than Mormons is President Obama. And so, we're talking about people that may not have a Romney bumper sticker on their car, but they may be holding their nose and going and voting for him anyway, like this. But or now it's more like this. So, I think it's real. It's there, but I think it's a bigger challenge to the nomination. And the thing about it is, some of those folks that have problems with his faith, the alternatives aren't necessarily better. Wink, nod. They're not, there's not a Mike Huckabee in this field. There's not someone like that. I mean, that some of the alternatives might have problems with some of those same sort of evangelical Christian voters, for example, have some beefs with some of these other folks of different kinds, and would keep them from sort of unifying behind one alternative to him.
I think with that, we're going to wrap it up.
Thank
Charlie Cook one more time.
Thank you.